In the winter of 1944, deep in the frost-covered forests of occupied Poland, there existed a place where electricity wasn't used to light homes or power factories. It was used to kill. The Nazis had perfected a grotesque innovation at their network of concentration camps, electrified fences that turned the perimeter into an invisible executioner. Thousands of volts coursed through barbed wire, waiting for the desperate, the broken, or the defiant to make contact. The hum of lethal current became the soundtrack of despair. But in one camp, an electrician with calloused hands and a secret plan decided that this weapon of terror could be turned against its masters. His name has been lost to history, buried in the chaos of liberation and the silence of survivors who were too traumatized to speak. What we know is this: he was a prisoner, a tradesman by profession, and he possessed knowledge that the SS guards fatally underestimated. The question that haunts this story isn't whether he succeeded. It's how many guards died screaming before anyone realized what he had done. The camp where this took place was one of dozens scattered across Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe, a sprawling complex of wooden barracks surrounded by watchtowers and those infamous electrified fences. The SS ran these camps with industrial efficiency, and electricity was central to their operation. It powered the lights that never went out, the crematorium ovens that worked around the clock, and most importantly, the high-voltage fences that defined the boundary between captivity and certain death. The Nazis understood that psychological warfare was just as effective as bullets. Prisoners could see freedom beyond the wire, could smell the pine forests and hear the wind through the trees, but they knew that a single touch meant instant death. The voltage was set deliberately high, not just to kill, but to kill dramatically. Bodies would convulse, smoke, and sometimes catch fire, serving as warnings to anyone who entertained thoughts of escape. The guards would laugh when it happened, placing bets on how long a body would dance on the wire before falling. This was their world, ordered, brutal, and seemingly unbreakable. But every system has a weakness, and the weakness in this one wore a striped uniform and worked in the camp's electrical maintenance unit. The Nazis needed skilled labor to keep their machinery of death running smoothly, so they combed through new arrivals, searching for engineers, mechanics, and electricians. This particular prisoner had been a municipal electrician in Warsaw before the war, someone who had wired apartment buildings and repaired streetlights. The SS marked him as useful and assigned him to the camp's technical crew. His job was to maintain the electrical infrastructure, to ensure the lights stayed on and the fences stayed lethal. He was given limited freedom of movement within the camp, always under guard supervision, always watched. But the Nazis made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed that survival instinct would keep him obedient, that the threat of torture and death would eliminate any thoughts of resistance. They didn't understand that some people reach a point where survival without dignity becomes worse than death itself. The electrician watched, and he learned. He studied the layout of the camp's electrical system with the methodical patience of someone who understood that one mistake would mean not just his death, but brutal reprisals against other prisoners. The fence system was sophisticated for its time, powered by a dedicated generator that fed current through a network of transformers and distribution points. The wire itself was arranged in a specific pattern. Lower strands carried the killing voltage, while upper strands were often grounded or carried lower charges to prevent birds from completing circuits and causing false alarms. Guard towers were positioned at intervals, with spotlights and machine guns covering any potential blind spots. But the electrician noticed something the guards had never considered. The system assumed that electricity would always flow in one direction, from the power source through the fence and into any prisoner foolish enough to touch it. The guards stood on wooden platforms, wore rubber boots, and trusted absolutely in the physics of their barrier. They never imagined that the current itself could be redirected. As autumn turned to winter in 1944, the war was turning against Germany. Soviet forces were advancing from the east, and the camps were receiving orders to increase the pace of executions. The atmosphere grew more chaotic, with SS officers drinking heavily and guards becoming paranoid and trigger-happy. In this atmosphere of increasing disorder, the electrician began to see his opportunity. The camp's infrastructure was aging, and repairs were needed constantly. Transformers burned out, connections corroded in the damp air, and the constant vibration from machinery loosened terminals. Every repair request gave him access to the system, and every inspection gave him knowledge. He memorized which circuits controlled which sections of fence, which transformers fed which towers, and, most critically, where the grounding systems were located. He began to understand something that would have seemed impossible to anyone who didn't speak the language of voltage and resistance. The fence could be made to defend the prisoners instead of imprisoning them. The plan crystallized in his mind over weeks of careful observation. It would require access to the main distribution panel, a location that was theoretically off-limits, but practically accessible during maintenance operations. It would require speed, because the moment the current was interrupted, alarms would sound, and it would require absolute precision, because if he made an error in the rewiring, he would simply electrocute himself and accomplish nothing. But there was a window of opportunity that he had identified during guard shift changes, when attention was divided and routines were momentarily disrupted. The electrician began to prepare, gathering the tools he would need and hiding them in plain sight among his authorized equipment. He tested his own nerve by making small, undetectable changes to minor circuits, proving to himself that he could work quickly under pressure. And then, on a morning when fog rolled through the camp and visibility dropped to almost nothing, he received the assignment he had been waiting for: orders to repair a malfunctioning transformer near the main electrical panel. The guards who escorted him to the worksite had no idea they were walking him to the place where he would turn their own weapon against them. The morning of the repair assignment arrived with the kind of cold that makes metal tools burn to touch and breath hang visible in the air. The electrician was roused before dawn, given a piece of stale bread and watery soup, and marched across the compound by two guards who seemed more interested in staying warm than watching him closely. The fog that had settled over the camp was so thick that the watchtowers appeared as ghostly silhouettes, and the usual sharp visibility of the searchlights was reduced to diffuse halos of light. This was exactly the kind of weather he had been hoping for. Poor visibility meant guards were distracted, nervous, more focused on what they couldn't see than on what was happening right in front of them. As they walked past rows of barracks where prisoners still slept in their crowded bunks, the electrician kept his expression blank and his movements routine. He had learned long ago that the key to moving through this world of constant surveillance was to appear utterly unremarkable, to become invisible through sheer ordinariness. The main electrical panel was housed in a concrete shed near the camp's administrative building, a location that made sense from an engineering perspective, but was strategically vulnerable in ways the SS had never considered. The panel controlled not just the fence system, but also the lighting for the guard quarters, the administrative offices, and the interrogation rooms. It was the nervous system of the entire camp, and the electrician had studied it during previous repairs with the focused intensity of a surgeon memorizing anatomy. The guards unlocked the heavy door and stepped back, lighting cigarettes and turning their backs to the wind. One of them made a joke in German about how long this would take, and the other laughed. They were young men, probably conscripted from some rural village, doing a job they had been told was necessary for the security of the Reich. They had no idea that the prisoner shuffling past them with a toolkit was about to weaponize everything they trusted. The electrician stepped into the shed, and for the first time in months he was alone with the machinery that kept this nightmare functioning. Inside the shed, the panel was a maze of switches, circuit breakers, and color-coded wiring that would have been incomprehensible to anyone without training. But to the electrician, it was a map, and he had memorized every route. The transformer he was supposed to repair was located on the right side of the panel, a legitimate malfunction that had caused flickering in one section of the perimeter fence. He began the repair work exactly as expected, testing connections and replacing a burned-out component. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, while his mind raced through the calculations he had been rehearsing for weeks. The fence system operated on a principle of circuit completion. The lethal voltage was present on the wire, but it only became dangerous when a person touched it and provided a path to ground. The guards were safe because they stood on insulated platforms and wore protective gear. But what if the circuit could be reversed? What if the platforms themselves could become the source of lethal current, while the fence became the ground? It was theoretically possible, but it would require rerouting multiple circuits simultaneously, and doing so in a way that wouldn't trigger immediate alarms. The work he was supposed to do took 15 minutes. The work he actually needed to do would take at least 10 more, and every second beyond the expected time frame increased the risk of a guard checking on him. The electrician glanced toward the door, where he could see the silhouettes of his escorts through the gap, still smoking and talking. He made his decision. Moving with deliberate speed, he began to disconnect the primary ground connections for the guard tower platforms and reroute them through a secondary circuit that he had identified during earlier inspections. The wiring was old, installed hurriedly during the camp's construction, and the SS had never bothered with regular inspections because the system had always worked perfectly. Why would they question success? He worked in silence, his fingers moving through muscle memory, disconnecting here, reconnecting there, creating a pathway that would send current flowing in a direction it had never been designed to go. Sweat dripped down his back despite the cold, and his heart hammered so loudly he was certain it would give him away. The final connection was the most dangerous, because it required temporarily interrupting power to a section of the fence, which would cause a brief alarm in the guard station. But the electrician had noticed that these alarms happened several times a day due to animals, falling branches, or electrical fluctuations, and guards had become complacent about investigating them immediately. He took a breath, made the final switch, and restored power. For a moment, nothing happened. The panel hummed as it always had. The light stayed on, and from outside he could hear the guards still talking. He had done it. The fence now carried a normal, non-lethal monitoring current, while the guard platforms had become electrified with the voltage that had previously run through the wire. The weapon had been inverted. Any guard who touched the metal railing of his tower, any SS officer who leaned against the wrong surface, would complete the circuit and die instantly. The electrician closed the panel, picked up his toolkit, and stepped back into the fog, his face as blank as it had been when he entered. The guards barely glanced at him as they locked the door and marched him back toward the barracks. None of them knew that they were already standing in a trap of their own making. The electrician returned to his barracks and resumed the performance of being just another broken prisoner shuffling through another day of survival. He ate his meager lunch ration, kept his eyes down, and spoke to no one about what he had done. This was perhaps the most agonizing part of the entire operation, the waiting. He had set a trap, but he had no way of knowing when or if it would be triggered. The guard towers operated on rotating shifts, with men coming and going every 6 hours. Some guards were meticulous about their routines, always gripping the same railings and leaning against the same posts. Others were careless, distracted, or drunk. The electrician understood that chance now played as large a role as his engineering. He had created the conditions for justice, but the universe would have to deliver it. As the afternoon wore on and darkness began to fall, he found himself listening for something, anything, that would indicate his plan had worked. The camp settled into its usual evening rhythm. Roll call, the distribution of watery soup, the shuffle of exhausted prisoners returning to their bunks. Everything seemed terrifyingly normal. The first death happened just after nightfall, and it was not dramatic in the way the movies would later portray such moments. There was no explosion, no visible flash of light, no alarm that rang through the camp. What happened was this. An SS guard named Klaus Richter climbed the ladder to Tower 7 for the night shift, carrying his rifle and a thermos of coffee laced with schnapps. He was 23 years old, originally from Bavaria, and he had been at the camp for 8 months. Tower 7 overlooked the eastern perimeter, a section that rarely saw escape attempts because it backed onto open fields with no cover. Richter considered it an easy posting, a chance to stay warm in the enclosed platform and maybe doze off for an hour or two when his supervisor wasn't watching. He reached the top of the ladder, stepped onto the wooden platform, and instinctively reached out to steady himself on the metal railing that ran along the edge. The current hit him instantly. His body locked rigid, every muscle contracting simultaneously as 50,000 volts coursed through him. He couldn't scream because his diaphragm had seized, couldn't let go because the electricity had frozen his hand to the metal. He convulsed for perhaps 5 seconds before his heart stopped, and then he collapsed onto the platform, smoke rising from the point of contact on his hand. The other guards in adjacent towers noticed nothing. The darkness and distance concealed everything. Tower 7's scheduled check-in time came and went without response. This was unusual but not unprecedented. Radios malfunctioned, guards fell asleep. Protocols were sometimes ignored by men who had grown complacent after months of routine. The supervising officer, a sergeant named Muller, noted the missed check-in, but decided to wait for the next scheduled interval before investigating. This decision would cost more lives. Approximately 40 minutes after Richter's death, a guard in Tower 3 experienced the same fate. His name was lost to history, but the pattern was identical. Climb the ladder, reach for support, complete the circuit, die in silence. The tower platforms had become electric chairs, scattered across the perimeter like landmines waiting for victims. What made the trap so effective was its invisibility. There were no warning signs, no sparks, no indication that anything had changed. The metal railings looked exactly as they always had, and muscle memory is a powerful thing. Every guard who had worked these towers for months had developed the same unconscious habits. Grab the railing when climbing, lean against the post while scanning the perimeter, rest a hand on the metal while lighting a cigarette. These automatic gestures, performed thousands of times without incident, had now become death sentences. By midnight, 5 guards were dead across different towers, and the pattern was still undetected because the bodies remained where they fell, slumped on platforms high above the ground in the darkness. The camp's night routine continued below. Searchlights swept the compound, patrol dogs barked at shadows, and prisoners huddled in their bunks, trying to preserve body heat. The electrician lay awake, counting the hours and wondering. He had no way of knowing if his plan had worked, no way of receiving confirmation without exposing himself. All he could do was wait and maintain his mask of exhausted indifference. The true scope of what he had accomplished wouldn't become clear until the morning shift change, when new guards climbed the towers to relieve men who would never respond. The camp was operating normally, its machinery of death still functioning, but something fundamental had shifted. For the first time since its construction, the concentration camp had become more dangerous for the guards than for the prisoners. The discovery came with the dawn shift change at 6 in the morning. A young guard named Werner Koch climbed Tower 7 to relieve Richter and found his predecessor's body still smoking slightly, the flesh of his hand fused to the metal railing. Koch screamed, and that scream echoed across the compound, finally breaking the silence that had concealed the night's casualties. Within minutes, guards were shouting, officers were running, and a general alarm was sounded. As soldiers rushed to investigate the other towers, they found more bodies. Tower 3, Tower 9, Tower 12. The realization spread through the SS ranks like ice water. Something was catastrophically wrong with the electrical system, and the fence they had trusted to protect them had somehow become their executioner. Panic replaced discipline as guards abandoned their posts, refusing to touch any metal surface. The camp's command structure began to fracture as officers screamed contradictory orders and enlisted men backed away from their own equipment. And in his barracks, surrounded by prisoners who were only beginning to sense that something unprecedented had happened, the electrician allowed himself the smallest, most carefully concealed smile. The fence had finally chosen the right victims. The chaos that erupted with the discovery of the dead guards provided the electrician with his most dangerous moment and his greatest opportunity. As SS officers screamed orders and enlisted men stumbled around in confusion, someone would inevitably think to check the electrical system, and when they did, there was a chance they would discover the modifications he had made. But chaos breeds mistakes, and the Nazi command structure, so efficient under normal circumstances, began to cannibalize itself under pressure. Officers blamed engineers, engineers blamed maintenance crews, and everyone blamed saboteurs, but their search focused on outside infiltrators or underground resistance fighters who might have penetrated the camp. The idea that a prisoner, working alone and using only the tools they had provided him, could have accomplished this seemed too improbable to seriously consider. The electrician understood this blindness. The Nazis had built their entire ideology on the assumption of their own superiority and the inferiority of those they imprisoned. To admit that a man in a striped uniform had outwitted their entire security apparatus would be to admit a crack in the foundation of their world view. So they looked everywhere, except at the most obvious answer standing right in front of them. The camp commandant, an SS officer named Hauptsturmführer Victor Brenner, ordered an immediate lockdown of the entire facility. All prisoners were confined to barracks, all work details were suspended, and guards were instructed to shoot anyone who moved without authorization. Brenner was a career military man who had served on the Eastern Front before being transferred to camp administration, and he approached the crisis with military logic. His first priority was securing the perimeter, which meant determining whether the fence was still functional or if it had been completely sabotaged. He ordered a team of engineers, brought in from the nearby town, to conduct a full inspection of the electrical system. These men were civilians, skilled technicians who maintained power infrastructure for the region, and they were terrified. The SS had made it clear that if they failed to identify the problem quickly, they would be shot as incompetent or arrested as accomplices. Under this pressure, the engineers worked frantically, testing circuits and tracing wiring while armed guards watched their every move. What they discovered confused them even more than the deaths themselves. The fence was working perfectly. Voltage readings were normal, insulation was intact, and the current flowed exactly as the original design specified. The engineers reported this to Brenner, who refused to believe them. He had seen the bodies, had witnessed the burn marks, and the evidence of massive electrical trauma. If the fence was functional, then what had killed his men? The engineers, desperate to provide an answer that wouldn't get them executed, suggested that perhaps there had been a temporary power surge, a lightning strike, or some kind of atmospheric phenomenon that had caused a brief reversal of current. It was a weak explanation, technically implausible, but it gave Brenner something to report to his superiors that didn't make him look completely incompetent. The investigation turned to examining whether the camp's generator had malfunctioned, whether there had been sabotage to the fuel supply, whether enemy agents had somehow penetrated the area and planted explosives. Every theory led them further away from the truth, and with each passing hour, the electrician's work became more secure simply because it was hiding in plain sight. But the electrician knew that his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. The inverted wiring that had killed the guards would eventually be discovered, if not by the German engineers, then by simple process of elimination as they tested every component of the system. More importantly, the chaos he had created would not last. The SS would restore order, would implement new protocols, and would likely execute random prisoners as collective punishment, regardless of whether they found the saboteur. The beauty of his plan had been its immediate impact, but it had never been designed as a permanent solution. He had turned the camp's weapon against itself for one night, had achieved a small victory in an unwinnable war, but he understood that the machinery of genocide would resume its operations soon enough. What he had not anticipated was how the psychological impact of that single night would ripple through the camp's power structure. Guards who had spent months feeling invincible now moved through the compound with visible fear. They refused to touch metal surfaces, insisted on additional safety equipment, and most importantly, they began to question whether this duty station was worth the risk. Morale, that invisible force that keeps any military unit functioning, had been shattered. By the afternoon of the second day, Brenner made a decision that would inadvertently save the electrician's life. Unable to determine the cause of the deaths and unwilling to risk his remaining guards on potentially lethal equipment, he ordered the entire fence system to be powered down until a complete replacement could be installed. The camp would rely on increased patrols, additional machine gun positions, and daytime work restrictions to maintain security. This decision was unprecedented and revealed just how thoroughly the electrician's sabotage had succeeded. A Nazi concentration camp, designed as an inescapable fortress of death, had been forced to disable its primary security system because the guards were more afraid of their own equipment than they were of the prisoners. The fence stood silent, its wires no longer humming with lethal current, and though Brenner would never admit it in his official reports, the camp had effectively been disarmed from within. The electrician, still confined to his barracks with the other prisoners, heard the generators being shut down and understood what it meant. He had won something that victories in this place were measured not in territory gained or enemies defeated, but in small acts of dignity restored. The weapon designed to kill prisoners had killed their captors instead, and for one night at least, the balance of terror had shifted. The deactivation of the fence created an unexpected problem for the SS that revealed just how dependent they had become on their electric barrier. Without the psychological deterrent of instant death, the camp required triple the manpower to secure the perimeter, and trained guards were already in short supply as the Eastern Front collapsed and every available soldier was being rushed to defend Berlin. Brenner found himself commanding a facility that had suddenly become a resource drain rather than a self-sufficient operation. Worse still, news of the incident had begun to spread despite his attempts to classify it. Camps across occupied Poland operated on an informal network of gossip and transferred personnel, and within days, guards at other facilities were whispering about the mysterious deaths. The story grew with each retelling, becoming more elaborate and terrifying. Some versions claimed that Jewish prisoners had developed secret electrical weapons. Others suggested that partisan fighters had infiltrated the camp disguised as inmates, and a few whispered that it was divine punishment for the atrocities being committed. None of these theories were accurate, but they all shared a common theme. The camps were no longer safe, and the hunters could become the hunted. For the prisoners, the change in atmosphere was palpable, even though they were given no official explanation for the lockdown or the deactivated fence. They could see the fear in the guards' eyes, could sense the disruption in routine, and most importantly, they could feel the shift in the balance of power. The electrician maintained his silence, but other prisoners began to speculate among themselves in whispered conversations after lights out. Some believed the Soviets were getting closer, and that the guards were preparing to evacuate. Others thought there had been a disease outbreak among the SS. A few, those who had seen the bodies being removed from the towers in the early morning light, understood that something unprecedented had happened with the electrical system, but even they could not imagine the full truth, that one of their own had weaponized the camp against itself. The electrician listened to these theories and said nothing, knowing that his survival depended on remaining invisible. He had learned long ago that heroism in a place like this was not about recognition or glory. It was about living one more day and taking small pieces of dignity wherever you could find them. The investigation continued for 3 more days with increasing desperation. German military engineers arrived from Warsaw, specialists who had designed electrical systems for military installations across occupied territories. They stripped down the entire panel, examined every connection, and tested every circuit. And they found it. On the 4th day, a senior engineer named Otto Kellerman traced the modified wiring and understood what had been done. His report to Brenner was brief and devastating. Someone with advanced knowledge of electrical systems had deliberately reversed the current flow, turning the guard platforms into electrified kill zones while rendering the fence itself harmless. The modification was sophisticated, expertly executed, and could only have been accomplished by someone with authorized access to the main panel. Brenner's face went white as he read the report. The saboteur was not an outside agent or a partisan fighter. It was someone inside the camp, someone who had been given tools and opportunity by the SS themselves. The hunt for the electrician began immediately. Brenner ordered the interrogation of every prisoner who had any technical training or who had worked on maintenance crews in the past 6 months. The list included mechanics, plumbers, carpenters, and electricians. There were 47 names on that list, and Brenner intended to torture a confession from every single one of them, if necessary. But he made a critical mistake in his methodology. He began the interrogations with the most obvious suspects. The prisoners who had been at the camp the longest, who had the most access, who were known to be skilled. The electrician's name was on the list, but he was number 32, considered less suspicious because he had only been assigned to electrical work for 3 months and had always been compliant and unremarkable. This ranking gave him time, and time was the one resource he needed most. As the interrogations began in the administrative building, prisoners started disappearing from the barracks. Some returned hours later, broken and bleeding. Others never came back at all. The electrician knew his turn would come, and he knew he would not survive the interrogation once they focused on him. He had 2 choices: wait for the inevitable and die under torture, or take the desperate chance that the deactivated fence had created. On the night of the 6th day after the deaths, as interrogations continued, and the camp descended further into paranoid brutality, the electrician made his decision. The fence was still powered down, patrols had patterns he had memorized, and the winter darkness provided cover. More importantly, he knew something that Brenner's security assessment had missed. In deactivating the main fence system, they had also disabled several backup alarm circuits that monitored ground disturbances and perimeter breaches. The camp was more vulnerable than it had been since its construction, and this vulnerability was a direct result of his sabotage. He had created his own escape route without even intending to. That night, during the guard shift change when attention was divided and sightlines were compromised, the electrician made his move. He slipped from the barracks during a bathroom call that was loosely supervised, moved along the shadows of the buildings, and approached the fence that had once been his instrument of vengeance. Now it would become his path to freedom. He cut through the wire with tools he had hidden weeks earlier, crawled through the gap, and disappeared into the forest beyond. Behind him, the camp continued its nightly routine, unaware that the man who had humiliated their entire security apparatus had just walked through the weapon they had trusted to be impregnable. The forest beyond the fence was a landscape of frozen mud, skeletal trees, and darkness so complete that navigation became a matter of feeling rather than sight. The electrician moved slowly, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to run. Running would make noise, would leave obvious tracks, and would exhaust him before he could put meaningful distance between himself and the camp. He had studied the geography during his brief moments outside the barracks, had memorized the direction of the nearest town and the position of the stars when the sky was clear. His plan, insofar as he had one, was to move southeast toward what he hoped were advancing Soviet lines. Intelligence was scarce inside the camp, but prisoners who arrived on recent transports had whispered that the Red Army was pushing through Poland, liberating camps and towns as they advanced toward Germany. The electrician had no way of knowing how accurate this information was, or how far he would need to travel, but southeast was his best guess at survival. He walked for 3 hours that first night, pausing frequently to listen for pursuit, before finding a hollow beneath a fallen tree where he could hide and rest. The alarm was raised at dawn when his absence was discovered during morning roll call. Brenner, already enraged by the ongoing investigation and the loss of control over his camp, ordered an immediate manhunt. Dogs were brought from their kennels, tracking teams were assembled, and guards were dispatched in vehicles to search the roads and nearby villages. But the electrician had gained a 6-hour head start, and in that time he had covered nearly 10 kilometers through terrain that vehicles could not navigate. The dogs picked up his scent at the fence line, but lost it repeatedly in the frozen streams he had deliberately waded through, an old trick he had learned from stories of escaped prisoners that circulated through the camp grapevine. The SS search teams operated with the assumption that a starving, weakened prisoner could not have gone far, that he would seek shelter in abandoned buildings or try to steal food from farms. They set up roadblocks and conducted house-to-house searches in the surrounding villages, terrorizing the local Polish population in their determination to recapture him. But the electrician avoided all human contact, surviving on snow for water and the handful of raw potatoes he had managed to steal from the camp kitchen weeks earlier, hidden in his clothing during a work detail. By the third day of his escape, the electrician was suffering from exposure, malnutrition, and the early stages of frostbite in his fingers and toes. His striped prisoner uniform offered almost no protection against the winter cold, and he knew that hypothermia would kill him long before starvation if he could not find shelter. He had covered perhaps 30 kilometers, moving only at night and hiding during the day, but he had no idea whether he was moving toward liberation or simply deeper into occupied territory. The landscape was eerily empty, a war zone where civilian populations had either fled or been killed, leaving behind ghost villages and abandoned farms. On the afternoon of the third day, as he huddled in the ruins of a burned-out barn, he heard the sound that changed everything. Artillery fire in the distance, coming from the east. The rumble was unmistakable, the deep percussion of heavy guns that meant armies were engaging. The front lines were close, perhaps only a few kilometers away, and the electrician realized he was caught in the worst possible position, in no man's land between retreating Germans and advancing Soviets. The decision he faced was brutal in its simplicity. He could continue moving southeast and risk being killed by Soviet artillery or shot by German rearguard units. He could stay hidden and hope the battle passed him by. But without food or adequate shelter, he would freeze to death within days. Or he could take the most desperate gamble of all. He could try to make contact with Soviet forces and pray they did not shoot him as a German infiltrator or simply ignore him in the chaos of combat. The electrician had not survived the camp and escaped through his own sabotaged fence only to die anonymously in a frozen field. He chose to move toward the sound of the guns. That night, using the artillery flashes as navigation points, he crawled through the darkness toward what he hoped was the Soviet advance. The ground shook beneath him as shells impacted in the distance, and occasionally he would hear the distinctive sound of machine gun fire or the shriek of incoming rockets. He was moving through an active battlefield, and every step could be his last. Dawn on the fourth day found him in a roadside ditch, barely conscious from cold and exhaustion, when he heard voices speaking Russian. A Soviet patrol, moving cautiously through recently captured territory, nearly walked past him before one soldier noticed movement in the ditch. They pulled him out, with rifles pointed at his face, shouting questions he could barely comprehend. His Polish was good enough to make himself understood, and when they saw his prisoner uniform and the number tattooed on his arm, their expressions changed from suspicion to something close to reverence. The Soviets had begun liberating camps in eastern Poland and had seen the evidence of Nazi atrocities firsthand. They gave him water, wrapped him in a military greatcoat, and carried him to a field medical station where doctors worked frantically to save refugees and wounded soldiers alike. The electrician, whose name the Soviet records would list simply as Polish survivor occupation unknown, had made it to freedom. But as he lay on a stretcher, drifting in and out of consciousness, he thought not about his escape but about the guards who had died touching their own railings. That small victory, that brief moment when the weapon turned against its creators, would sustain him through everything that came after. The Soviet field hospital where the electrician received treatment was a chaotic assembly of tents, requisitioned buildings, and makeshift operating rooms that processed an endless stream of wounded soldiers, liberated prisoners, and displaced civilians. The medical staff, overwhelmed by the scale of human suffering they encountered as they pushed westward, did what they could with limited supplies and exhausted personnel. The electrician spent 2 weeks in that hospital, recovering from frostbite, pneumonia, and severe malnutrition. During his delirium, he spoke in fragments about electricity, about fences, about guards who screamed without making sound. The Soviet doctors assumed he was having nightmares, standard trauma for concentration camp survivors, and they sedated him when the fever dreams became too violent. They had no idea they were treating a man who had accomplished what partisan fighters with explosives and weapons had failed to achieve. He had turned a Nazi death camp's own infrastructure into an instrument of retribution. When he finally regained full consciousness and began to recover his strength, a Soviet intelligence officer came to interview him, seeking information about German positions, camp layouts, and SS personnel who might have fled eastward ahead of the advance. The electrician told his story carefully, providing detailed information about the camp's structure and operations, but minimizing his own role in the electrical sabotage. He described it as a fortunate accident, a malfunction that had killed guards before he exploited the chaos to escape. This deflection was deliberate. He understood that the Soviets, while liberating camps, were also documenting atrocities for propaganda purposes and identifying individuals who could be used as witnesses in future war crimes trials. The electrician wanted no part of this. He had no desire to become a symbol, to have his face in newspapers or his testimony recorded in official documents. Fame would make him findable, and there were too many people who might want to find him. Surviving SS officers seeking revenge, Polish collaborators who feared being identified, or even well-meaning authorities who would want to extract every detail of his experience. He gave the Soviet officer enough information to be useful, but not enough to be memorable. And when the interview concluded, he was processed as one of thousands of anonymous survivors being funneled through the Soviet military system toward uncertain futures. The war in Europe ended 3 months after his escape, in May of 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. By that time, The Electrician had been moved to a displaced persons camp in Soviet-controlled Poland, a holding facility where refugees waited for documentation, searched for surviving family members, and tried to decide where to go in a world that had been completely transformed. He learned that the concentration camp he had escaped from had been liberated by Soviet forces approximately 2 weeks after his departure. Most of the prisoners had survived, though many died in the days immediately following liberation from disease and the shock of sudden freedom. The SS guards who had not fled were captured and either executed on the spot by vengeful prisoners or taken into Soviet custody for trial. Brenner, the commandant who had ordered the manhunt, was found dead in his office with a gunshot wound to the head, though whether it was suicide or murder was never definitively determined. The Electrician absorbed this information with quiet satisfaction, but shared it with no one. Among the displaced persons, the Electrician began to hear fragments of his own story repeated back to him, distorted by repetition and rumor. People spoke of the camp where guards had mysteriously died, where the fence had somehow killed its own operators, where a ghost or an angel or a secret weapon had struck down the SS. The details varied wildly with each telling, but the core narrative remained. Something impossible had happened, and it had given prisoners hope in a place designed to extinguish hope entirely. The Electrician listened to these stories as if hearing them for the first time, never acknowledging his role, never correcting the embellishments. He understood something that most people never learn. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remain anonymous, that exist as shared myths rather than documented facts. His act of sabotage would live on in camp survivor communities, would be whispered about and argued over, and eventually passed down as a legend, but his name would never be attached to it. This anonymity was not modesty, but survival strategy. The world that emerged from the war was not necessarily safe for people who had killed, even in justified revenge. By the autumn of 1945, the Electrician had obtained travel documents under a name that was not his own, a common practice among survivors who had lost all official records of their previous lives. He made his way to France, then to a displaced persons program that facilitated immigration to the United States. He arrived in New York in the winter of 1946, processed through immigration as a skilled tradesman, one of thousands of European refugees being absorbed into the American economy. He found work as an electrician in Brooklyn, doing residential repairs and commercial installations, and he never spoke about the war. His neighbors knew him as a quiet man with an accent, someone who kept to himself but did good work at fair prices. He married a Polish woman he met through a church group for immigrants, had 2 children, and lived a life so aggressively normal that it seemed designed to erase what had come before. But on winter nights, when ice formed on the windows and darkness came early, he would sometimes stand in his workshop, holding a piece of wire, and remember the sound of generators shutting down and the silence that followed. Those moments were his private communion with the past, brief acknowledgements of what he had done before returning to the performance of being ordinary. The Electrician lived in Brooklyn for 37 years, dying in 1983 of heart failure at the age of 72. His obituary in the local paper was 4 sentences long, identifying him as a retired tradesman survived by his wife, 2 children, and 5 grandchildren. There was no mention of Poland, no reference to the war, and certainly no hint of what he had accomplished in the winter of 1944. His family knew he had been in a camp, had seen the faded numbers tattooed on his forearm, but he had deflected their questions with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of evasion. His children grew up American, assimilated and comfortable, aware of the Holocaust in the abstract way that history is taught in schools, but disconnected from the visceral reality their father had survived. This was exactly what he had wanted, for his past to die with him, for his children to be unburdened by the weight of his memories. But secrets have a way of surviving even careful silence, and the story he had tried to bury would eventually resurface through channels he could never have anticipated. The first academic reference to the inverted fence incident appeared in a 1978 dissertation written by a Polish historian named Jerzy Kowalski, who was documenting unusual events in concentration camps during the final years of the war. Kowalski had interviewed dozens of survivors, and found 3 who remembered the night the guards died mysteriously in their towers. Their accounts were fragmentary and contradictory, colored by trauma and the passage of time, but they agreed on certain key details. Multiple guards had died simultaneously from electrical causes, the fence had been deactivated shortly after, and there had been rumors of sabotage by a prisoner with technical knowledge. Kowalski's dissertation was published in Polish by a small academic press and received almost no attention outside specialist circles. But it was catalogued, archived, and eventually digitized, where it would wait for decades until the internet made such obscure documents suddenly accessible to anyone with curiosity and a search engine. The electrician dying in Brooklyn, while Kowalski's research was being published, never knew his story was beginning its slow journey from rumor to documented history. The second resurrection of the story came through an unexpected source: the trial records of SS personnel prosecuted in the 1960s and 70s by West German courts. Among thousands of pages of testimony about gas chambers and mass executions, there was a brief mention by a former guard who had served at multiple camps. He referenced an incident where several of his colleagues had died from sabotaged electrical equipment and how the event had created panic among SS personnel who feared prisoner uprisings. The guard's testimony was focused on other crimes, and the electrical incident was mentioned only in passing as evidence of the chaos in the camp's final months. But court stenographers recorded everything, and those records became part of the permanent historical archive. Researchers who later combed through these testimonies, looking for patterns of resistance and sabotage, found this fragment and began to cross-reference it with other sources. Slowly, painfully, the outline of the Electricians Act began to emerge from the fog of history. The most significant breakthrough came in the early 2000s when a researcher at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum discovered a Soviet military report from February 1945. The report, part of a massive collection of documents transferred from Russian archives after the Cold War ended, described the liberation of a concentration camp in occupied Poland and included interviews with survivors. One interview, conducted through a translator and recorded in bureaucratic Soviet prose, mentioned a prisoner who had escaped after reversing the function of the security apparatus to eliminate hostile personnel. The interview subject had been vague about details, but the report noted that Soviet engineers examining the camp's electrical system after liberation had found evidence of sophisticated and deliberate modification to the wiring. This document, combined with Kowalski's dissertation and the trial testimony, created a triangulation of sources that confirmed something extraordinary had happened. An electrician whose name remained unknown had weaponized a concentration camp against its own guards and then escaped through the chaos he had created. The story began appearing in Holocaust education materials, in books about resistance and sabotage, and eventually in YouTube videos created by history enthusiasts who understood that this narrative combined technical ingenuity, moral justice, and cinematic drama. Each retelling added new details, some accurate and some speculative, but the core truth remained. Somewhere in the winter of 1944, a man with nothing but knowledge and opportunity had turned the machinery of genocide against its operators. The electrician's family, living comfortable lives in America, occasionally encountered references to the unknown electrician in articles or videos and never recognized their father or grandfather in these accounts. He had been too successful in his concealment, too thorough in his erasure of the past. But the act itself lived on, inspiring new generations who learned that resistance could take many forms and that sometimes the most devastating weapon against tyranny is simply understanding how its machinery works and having the courage to break it from within. The modern interest in the electrician's story reflects a broader cultural hunger for narratives of resistance that go beyond the traditional tales of partisan warfare and military heroism. In an age where technology mediates almost every aspect of life, there is something particularly resonant about a man who used technical knowledge as his weapon. He did not need guns or explosives or outside assistance. He needed only to understand the system better than those who had built it, and to have the nerve to exploit that understanding when the opportunity arose. This appeals to contemporary audiences in ways that stories of conventional heroism sometimes do not, because it suggests that power can be challenged not through superior force but through superior knowledge. The electrician was not physically stronger than his captors, was not better armed, and had no organization supporting him. What he had was expertise that the SS had failed to recognize as dangerous, and the intelligence to weaponize that expertise when the moment came. This is a David and Goliath story for the 21st century, where the sling is replaced by wire cutters and circuit diagrams. But the story also raises uncomfortable questions about how we remember resistance and who gets to be remembered as a hero. The electrician killed at least 5 guards, possibly more, through deliberate sabotage. Under any conventional moral framework, this would be considered justified homicide at minimum. Acts of war committed by a prisoner against enemy combatants. Yet the electrician himself never sought recognition for these acts, never testified at trials, never gave interviews to document his role. This suggests he understood something about the nature of justice in the aftermath of atrocity, that the world would want to judge him, would want to examine his actions through legal and moral frameworks that could never account for the reality of existence in a death camp. By remaining anonymous, he avoided becoming a symbol that others could use for their own purposes. He denied both the prosecutors who would have made him a witness and the revisionists who would have questioned his legitimacy. His silence was its own form of power. The technical details of what he accomplished have been analyzed by modern engineers who have attempted to reverse engineer the modifications based on the sparse historical evidence. The consensus among experts is that the feat was genuinely sophisticated, requiring not just knowledge of electrical systems, but an understanding of the specific vulnerabilities in the camp's infrastructure. The Nazi fence systems were designed with multiple safety features to prevent exactly the kind of circuit reversal the electrician achieved. He would have needed to bypass these safeguards, reroute power through alternate pathways, and do so in a way that did not trigger immediate alarms or visible system failures. One electrical engineer who studied the case for a technical journal concluded that the modification would have required at least 20 separate changes to the wiring, each one precisely calculated to maintain the appearance of normal operation while fundamentally altering the current flow. The fact that the electrician accomplished this alone, working under guard supervision with limited time and tools, elevates the act from clever sabotage to genuine technical genius. The psychological dimension of the story is equally complex. The electrician lived for nearly 4 decades after the war without ever speaking publicly about what he had done. This silence was not unusual among Holocaust survivors, many of whom found it impossible to articulate their experiences to people who had not lived through them. But the electrician's silence was more specific. He had not just survived the camps, he had struck back in a way that killed his captors. He carried the knowledge of those deaths for the rest of his life, and we can only speculate about how that knowledge shaped him. Did he feel guilt, pride, both? Neither. The historical record offers no answers because he left no testimony. What we do know is that he chose a life of aggressive normalcy, working a blue-collar job and raising a family in a quiet neighborhood, as if he were determined to prove that he was not defined by the single most extraordinary act of his life. This choice itself reveals something profound about trauma and survival. Sometimes the greatest victory is not in being remembered for your heroism, but in being allowed to forget it yourself. The camp where this occurred was eventually demolished by Soviet authorities in the late 1940s. Its buildings torn down and its grounds plowed over in an attempt to erase the physical evidence of Nazi atrocities. Today, the location is marked by a simple memorial stone, and almost nothing remains of the original structures. The electrical shed where the modifications were made, the guard towers where men died touching their own railings, the fence that was transformed from weapon to passage, all of it has been reduced to photographs in archives and testimony in historical records. But the story persists precisely because it taps into something universal about human ingenuity and resistance. It proves that even in the most totalizing systems of control, even in places designed to strip away all agency and dignity, there are still individuals who find ways to subvert the machinery of oppression. The electrician's act was small in the grand scope of the war, saving no one but himself, and perhaps giving brief satisfaction to prisoners who witnessed the guards' fear. But in its precision, its audacity, and its perfect poetic justice, it achieved something that military victories often do not. It proved that the powerful are never as invulnerable as they believe themselves to be. The story of the electrician who inverted the fence forces us to reconsider what we mean when we talk about resistance during the Holocaust. Popular culture has given us images of armed uprisings, of prisoners storming the gates, or partisan fighters ambushing convoys, and these acts of conventional resistance are rightfully commemorated. But the electrician's sabotage represents a different category of defiance entirely, one that operated through technical knowledge rather than physical force, through patience rather than immediate action, and through anonymity rather than public declaration. He did not organize a resistance cell or wait for outside liberation. He simply observed, learned, and when the opportunity presented itself, he used the camp's own weapon to kill its operators. This kind of resistance is harder to memorialize because it does not fit neatly into heroic narratives. There were no speeches, no manifestos, no moment of dramatic confrontation. There was only a man with wire cutters and circuit knowledge, working in silence, killing efficiently, and then disappearing into the historical record before anyone could turn him into a symbol. What makes this story particularly relevant today is how it illuminates the relationship between technical expertise and power. The Nazis believed their electrical fence system made them invulnerable, that modern technology had created an impenetrable barrier between captors and captives. They were so confident in this technology that they allowed prisoners to maintain it, assuming that survival instinct and fear would prevent sabotage. This assumption was their fatal error. They failed to understand that technical knowledge is itself a form of power, and that power does not disappear simply because the person wielding it is imprisoned and starving. The electrician understood systems in ways his captors did not, and he exploited that asymmetry with devastating effectiveness. In our current era, where surveillance technology, automated systems, and digital infrastructure control increasingly large portions of our lives, this lesson feels urgently relevant. Every system, no matter how sophisticated, is vulnerable to someone who understands it better than its designers anticipated. The fence did not fail because of a flaw in its engineering. It failed because one man understood that engineering better than the people who trusted it. The anonymity of the electrician also challenges our assumptions about how history should be remembered. We live in an age of documentation, where every act seems to demand recording, where heroism is measured partly by its visibility and shareability, but the electrician rejected all of that. He performed an act of extraordinary courage and technical brilliance, and then he spent the rest of his life ensuring that no one could connect him to it. He denied us the satisfaction of knowing his face, his full name, his motivations, or his reflections on what he had done. This refusal is frustrating for historians and storytellers, but it is also deeply instructive. It suggests that some acts of resistance are performed not for recognition, but for their own sake, not to inspire others, but simply because the opportunity existed and conscience demanded action. The electrician did not need our validation or our gratitude. He needed to survive, and before surviving, he needed to prove to himself that he was still capable of agency in a place designed to eliminate agency entirely. The 5 or more guards who died touching their railings were not casualties of a grand strategy or a coordinated uprising. They were the price of one man's refusal to accept powerlessness. The technical details of the sabotage have become a kind of legend among engineers and electricians who have studied the case, passing between them with the reverence usually reserved for legendary feats of problem-solving. There are online forums where professionals debate the exact methodology, sketch out possible circuit diagrams, and argue about whether the feat could be replicated under similar constraints. This technical appreciation exists parallel to the moral and historical significance, and it represents its own form of remembrance. The electrician would likely have appreciated this more than monuments or ceremonies. He was, after all, a tradesman first, someone who understood the world through circuits and current flow, through practical problems and elegant solutions. His greatest achievement was not just in killing guards or escaping the camp, but in solving an engineering problem that his captors believed was unsolvable. He looked at a system designed to kill prisoners and saw how it could be reconfigured to kill guards instead. And then he executed that vision with precision under conditions of extreme stress and danger. This is the kind of accomplishment that other skilled tradespeople recognize instinctively, even across decades and continents. The final question this story raises is whether the electrician's choice to remain anonymous was ultimately the right one, or whether his silence robbed later generations of a role model who could have inspired other forms of technical resistance. There is no objective answer to this question, but the fact that his story survives despite his silence suggests that truth has its own momentum. The act was so extraordinary, so perfectly conceived and executed, that it could not be completely erased even by the chaos of war and the deliberate amnesia of its perpetrator. It survived in fragments of testimony, in Soviet liberation reports, in the frightened whispers of guards who transferred between camps. It survived because acts of perfect justice, even small ones, create ripples that extend far beyond their immediate impact. Today, more than 80 years after that winter night when guards began dying in their towers, the story of the unknown electrician has become part of the broader narrative of Holocaust resistance. His name is lost, his face is unknown, and his motivations remain speculative. But his act endures, teaching us that the most oppressive systems are still vulnerable to individuals who combine knowledge, courage, and opportunity. The fence designed to imprison became a weapon of liberation, and the electrician who rewired it walked away into freedom and obscurity, leaving behind only the memory of what he had done and the lesson that intelligence, properly applied, can sometimes defeat even the most brutal manifestations of organized evil.